FTSE Markets report the FTSE 100 has ended the day down 33 points at 72.13, the pound buying $1.26 and a euro 14. LBC weather, rain clearing most areas overnight, but some showers still likely for Northern Ireland and southwest England. Patchy fog elsewhere with a low of 4 tomorrow, a mix of sunshine and downpours, heavier across the south and far west, a high of 17 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Lisa Aziz.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. In this epic autumn of politics, this may well be the biggest week of the lot. Of course, we have the summit coming up in Brussels on Thursday and Friday, and then the historic sitting taking place in the House of Commons on Saturday. And lots of talk from the Conservative Eurosceptic side about compromise, lots of talk coming from Labour about perhaps a second referendum. But before we get on to that, I think we should make mention of the fact that amidst much pomp and circumstance, today was the state opening of Parliament, something that normally would have dominated the political agenda. Well, watching the great pageant and the policies that were announced was LBC senior reporter Matthew Thompson. Matthew, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel.
So tell me, what kind of policies have been unveiled, and does it really make any difference?
Well, look, pomp and ceremony isn't everyone's cup of tea, but if you like a bit of that kind of thing, no one quite does it like the Brits, do they? But amidst all of the prancing around and knocking on doors and golden carriages, there were 26 bills announced in the Queen's speech this morning on everything from health, education, defence, technology, transport and crime, as well, of course, as Brexit. Now, the Queen sat down, I should say, in the Lords today, and announced that her government's priority has always been to secure the UK's departure from the EU on the 31st of October. Now, that's a notable hardening of the language from the last Queen's speech in 2017, when she said simply that my government's priority is to secure the best possible deal. So a noted hardening, which in some ways reflects the shift from Theresa May to Boris Johnson. But there were similarities with Theresa May, Nigel, in the sense that the 6 Brexit bills that were announced are exactly the same ones that were in the last Queen's speech, none of which were able to get through in the last parliamentary session. That's things like the withdrawal bill, of course, which implements any deal that eventually comes back, fisheries, agriculture, financial services, immigration and the like. But aside from Brexit, and the main focus, I think, was really on law and order. There were a variety of bills announced in the speech that focused on, for example, sentencing. There's a sentencing bill which proposes longer sentences for serious offenders by removing the automatic release halfway through a sentence. There's a foreign national offenders bill to impose tougher sentences on foreign criminals who sneak back into the country. And the domestic abuse bill is being brought back before Parliament. And aside from that, Nigel, there was a tips bill to make sure employers pass on all tips to their employees. There was a bill to give police more powers to tackle drones after, of course, all of the disruption that we've seen at airports in recent months. A Grenfell Tower bill to toughen up regulations on high-rise buildings, and many more besides. But, Nigel, here is the rub. Boris Johnson simply doesn't have the majority in Parliament to deliver any of those things. And that is why you've had the likes of Jeremy Corbyn today saying that the whole thing is a pre-election farce. It's a stunt. Because we know that the Queen's speech is usually, in normal times, the time for the government to announce its legislative agenda for the next year. But in order to do that, it needs a majority. And there's a very strong chance, Nigel, that Boris Johnson will lose the vote on this Queen's speech that happens in 5 days' time, which is almost unprecedented in modern parliamentary history. The last Prime Minister, if you're interested in that kind of thing, to lose a Queen's speech was Stanley Baldwin back in 1924. And you'll never guess what he did. He resigned immediately. Now, whether Boris Johnson will do the same thing remains to be seen, but I wouldn't bet a huge amount of money on it, Nigel.
No, absolutely, Matthew. Thank you very much indeed. And, as I say, in normal circumstances, this would dominate the agenda for the rest of this week. A big, ambitious programme, some really tough talking on crime. Mind you, I've got to tell you, folks, at my age, I've heard Conservative governments say this time and again, and not much seems to change to me. But, as Matthew Thompson says, it could all be irrelevant. So it is Brexit that is dominating, and of course we had this coming together on the Wirral last week of the Irish Taoiseach, the British Prime Minister. Negotiations have been intensely going on over the course of the weekend. They say they're in the tunnel. This is the Brussels parlance for these negotiations. None of us actually quite know exactly what's being discussed, exactly what's being agreed, but it would appear that whatever we say, Brussels always wants a little bit more. But how can this government, how can this Prime Minister deliver Brexit on the 31st of October unless it is by reheating and amending, hopefully for them, Mrs May's withdrawal agreement? And everyone's calling it a deal. It's not a deal, folks. It's a new EU treaty binding in international law and preparing everybody for what you may call a compromise, some may call a sellout. Jacob Rees-Mogg, yesterday morning, here he was on Sky News.
We'll have to wait and see what the precise details are. Naturally, in the middle of a negotiation, these matters are extremely sensitive because everybody is compromising to some degree, and therefore to give the negotiations the best chance of succeeding, it's best to be discreet about them.
I can't help thinking that the plan sounds a little bit similar to the customs partnership put forward by Theresa May last year. Now, that, of course, was a plan that you described at the time as completely cretinous, impractical, bureaucratic, and a betrayal of common sense. So have you changed your mind?
Well, I don't know whether you're right or wrong, so we'll have to find out in a day or two whether I will have to eat my words or not. Time will tell.
So you are thinking that you might have to eat your words then? So what's changed?
I don't know, but there's a line from Churchill saying he'd often had to eat his own words and he'd found it to be a very nourishing diet. And that is something that happens in politics.
I have to say, I watched that interview and I thought Jacob looked incredibly uncomfortable, to the point of being a bit shifty, unhappy. It didn't look like Jacob Rees-Mogg at all. But he also urged, in an article that he wrote in the Sunday Telegraph yesterday, that Conservative Brexiteers need to compromise, and this is the word, compromise with Boris so that we can get Brexit done. And this, and by the way, I'm a big fan of Jacob Rees-Mogg, but this was Jacob Rees-Mogg who described Mrs May's attempts to get that EU treaty through the House of Commons. Well, for the first two times, he said it was so awful it would reduce us to a slave state. And then at the third time of asking, he said the choice seems to be between Mrs May's deal or no Brexit. So, Jacob has already eaten his words, so perhaps he's got quite practiced at it. And it's worth reminding ourselves that with Boris Johnson, it is exactly the same. Boris Johnson said that the new EU treaty would reduce us to being a slave state. And then, in a long series of tweets, he said, I have been and remain intensely critical of the deal, but we have to make a choice. And that means choosing between options that actually exist. I have come to the sad conclusion that neither this government nor this parliament is willing to leave with no deal. It's very painful for me to vote for this deal. So both Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson have eaten their words before, and it looks like that process this week is going to continue. I think that the Prime Minister is desperate to come back on Friday evening with something to put before Parliament on Saturday. That is my feeling. And I have to say, Sammy Wilson of the DUP has responded by saying that Jacob may eat his words. We in the DUP are still eating off the same menu. So if you're a Brexiteer, or if even indeed, if you're a Remainer, how much are you willing to compromise? 0345 6060 973. John in Chelmsford says, I voted leave and I never expected the EU to let us. I foolishly believe Mrs May's no deal is better than a bad deal. She lied. I want WTO terms which is what I expected. Nigel Boris needs to revoke Article 50, wiping away all obstacles, second referendum, Ben Act, Parliament, refusing a general election. I have to say, Ian, that if Boris Johnson revokes Article 50, that will be the end of the 200-year-old Conservative Party. There would be no more. I have got to speak to Anujip, who's calling from Hammersmith. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening. So, are they compromising? Are Boris and Jacob Rees-Mogg compromising, or are they effectively selling out from the principles that they used to believe in?
I think they are compromising, but I think to get a deal through, they are going to have to compromise at the end of the day.
Right, but and you called it a deal, but I'm going to just, repeat the point that it is an EU treaty. If in that EU treaty we hand over a very large sum of money with absolutely no guarantee of a trade deal being allowed to us without keeping in line with customs union rules. Now, maybe Brussels will say, OK, Boris, we're going to rewrite the political declaration. But if things stay roughly as they are, with some changes on the wording on Ireland, but if we're still part of the customs union and a single market for a transition period with no guarantee of a trade deal at the end, is that a compromise that's worth having?
I think it is. And what's interesting is you talked about how Jacob Rees-Mogg has changed his mind and gone back on his word. But before the referendum, there are plenty of clips of you saying, for example, that you support the Norway model. No.
I said Norway's better than us, but we can do even better than they are. At least Norway can catch their own fish. I never ever advocated the Norway model. I merely pointed out that Norway and Switzerland were better off than being full members. That was all.
Yeah, I can play the clips. You said they're prosperous, they're rich, they make their own decisions.
Yes, and we can do even better.
There's a whole video of you on YouTube with the ESDG group where you just talk about the Norway model and how good it is and how they're controlling their fisheries.
I never, ever advocated it for us. I merely pointed out they're a very wealthy nation with a 200-mile exclusive fishing zone, but that is not really the point, is it? The point is, do you think that if this compromise is reached and if this new treaty is voted for in the House of Commons, do you think that will end the Brexit row?
I don't think it will end the Brexit row, because even if we get a deal, I think you will argue, and I think people on the hard Brexiteers will argue this isn't a true Brexit. And I think the argument will go on. And I don't think this deal will get through Parliament. So, for example, you can see they've called a budget for, I think, the 6th of November, which indicates that Boris doesn't think himself that he's going to get Brexit done by October the 31st. Because if it was done by October the 31st, there would probably be an election immediately after that. So the fact he's called the budget that late, I think, shows that he won't get a deal through. But I do want to push back on something you said. So you're saying that you didn't advocate for the Norway deal. But
No. I'm sorry. I'm done with this. Norway and Switzerland had their own deals as tiddly countries. In Norway's case, a population of 5 million. I say one of 66 million could get an even better deal. You are listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC at 16 minutes past 6, and it's time for the news headlines with Lisa Riis.
A British man has died in Bulgaria ahead of England's Euro 2020 qualifier tonight. Boris Johnson's first Queen's speech promising 26 bills, 7 of them relating to crime and justice. Since
1963, those two countries have met to try and thrash out what they want to achieve at the summit. It's why many say it's been a Franco-German club from the very beginning. Mrs. Merkel made a comment after that dinner that I think was very, very revealing. She said, with the UK leaving the EU, the UK becomes a potential competitor that could rival the USA or China. Now, this is said by her with horror, because the one thing the European Union does not want is competition. It's why they have a single market. It's why they have a customs union, to make everybody the same. And they are deeply fearful that if we leave the European Union and leave the single market and leave the customs union, we'll become the magnet for global investment. We'll become the place that actually is economically more successful than they are. And I hear all these politicians saying, oh my goodness me, if we left with a clean break, it'd be an economic catastrophe. And yet it's the one thing the other side in this negotiation genuinely fears. But tell me, am I wrong? Should we compromise? Should we sign up to this new European treaty? Albeit, we don't yet know what amendments will and will not be agreed in Brussels this Thursday night. Let's go to John in Weston-super-Mare. Good evening, John.
Oh, hello, Nigel. Thank you for taking my call. I think, certainly from my experience in business, to get a reasonable deal, both sides will need to compromise. I think one of my concerns is, we've compromised by saying we're not actually going to have discuss trade treaties at the moment. We're going to support the EU army. This is all assuming that Boris's deal is based on Theresa May's treaty.
Yes.
ECJ is going to be going for many, many more years. We're going to pay at least £39,000 million to the EU, and it will still allow the UK fishing grounds as well as bailing out the EIB. So I think my question to you is, what compromises do you believe the EU has actually made?
Well, that's a very good question, John, and I'm struggling to answer it. You see, the biggest compromise was this. Do you remember at the beginning, David Davis said, nothing will be agreed until everything's agreed, and that meant we would agree a future trade relationship along with the terms of departure. And Mrs May agreed to what's called the sequencing, namely that we get the withdrawal agreement, that new treaty, out of the way before we move on. John, I don't think they've made a single concession at all. Do you?
I don't, not at all. I think Boris is now desperate for the deal.
Yes.
And will be making lots of compromises where we should be pushing far more. And I have got a slightly second question. We've done some preparation in this country for a no-deal Brexit. You go to Europe, obviously, quite a lot. What's your experience of the preparations of various EU countries have made?
Oh, my impression, whether you like or loathe the way the European Commission run the European Union, they're really good at what they do, and they are ready for whatever contingency. Hey, you know what, John, they've got a trade surplus of about 90 billion a year. They're going to make damn sure that the ports operate as smoothly as possible. I think they're in a better my hunch is, my feeling is, talking to both sides, they're in a better state of preparedness than we are. John, thank you for your call. Now, Barry from Selby says, you've been correct about Boris from the day he became PM. Doubts about his intentions were well-founded. Barry, I've tried to be as supportive of the Prime Minister as I possibly can. I like his optimism. I like his energy. I love it when he says we're leaving on the 31st of October, deal or no deal. I love it all. I just, over the last couple of weeks, asked myself whether he actually believes it to be true. And from the start, he said his highest priority was to return to Mrs May's treaty and to amend it, the very treaty that he said would lead to us becoming a vassal state. So I've now got, some real, genuine concerns. Gail from Somerset says, I admire Jacob Rees-Mogg, but he's gone down on my estimation over his stance on the deal. What a shame. Well, Gail, or anybody else, if you want to comment or question Jacob Rees-Mogg, he's going to be on tomorrow morning, 8:30 with Nick Ferrari, 0345 6060 973, and you can ring in Gail and ask Jacob why he's decided to change his mind and make these compromises. Maybe he is being pragmatic, but to me, it's just not Brexit, and I can't ever see it being Brexit, and I think it will lead to years of acrimony. I really do. Eric is a new caller from Beaconsfield. Good evening, Eric.
Good evening. Before I start discussing with you about compromise, I'd just like to take issue with a point you made before the break. You referred to Switzerland as a piddly country.
No, I said Norway had a population of 5 million.
And you said that Switzerland and Norway were piddly countries, and that was what you said. And I do take offence to that.
And I qualified it by saying Norway was 5 million. All right, I could have said Switzerland's 15. Fine, okay. Eric, that aside, it's not 66 million, is it?
No, it's not 66 million, but that's largely irrelevant. I do prefer that people would keep the language civil. Anyway.
All right, Norway's a giant country. I will refer to Norway as a giant country in future. Eric, carry on.
I'm not talking about Norway, I'm talking about Switzerland, if he'd listened. Compromise. It seems that we had our referendum, and the vote was closed, and yes, there was a majority for leave, but there was 48.2 or thereabout Remain voters. Since then, and you and others expected them to compromise and them to put aside their views to take the country forward with leave. Then the soft levers come on. It just strikes me, and I actually see I see it panning out as follows. I actually see there being no Brexit, which suits me fine. But the reason I see there being no Brexit is the only group of people who have not compromised all the way along have been the ultra-leaver, the WTO group, who have sought out, almost with a religious fanaticism, their intention to have this purity of a total clean break Brexit, which, by the by, the whole prospect of clean break Brexit is an absolute nonsense.
Well, we wouldn't be in the single market, Eric, would we? We wouldn't be in the customs union. There'd be no ECJ jurisdiction. We wouldn't give them $39 billion, and we'd catch our own fish.
Yeah, what happens next week?
Well, I'm just telling you, that's where we'd be.
It's cloud cuckoo land, Nigel.
It isn't. Eric, come on. There are lots of independent countries around the world, about 180 of them.
Yes, but they don't sit next door to 28 other ones.
Is that really, in a modern global economy, is that really relevant?
In a modern global economy where we are having, and we will have increasingly, issues with transportation around the planet for ecological reasons, and that we are not going to be in a trading group with the people that live next door to us. But that's not the point. My point bringing up...
Eric, I've always wanted to be in a trading bloc, all right? I've always wanted to be... Let me finish this point. I've always wanted...
Let me finish my point.
Hang on, for 25 years, I've campaigned for us to have a free trade deal, all right? I've wanted that as somebody that came into politics from business. The problem is, it's just not on offer in the next 20 days, is it?
What do you mean? It's not on offer in the next 20 days?
Well, we could, if we'd taken up Donald Tusk's offer 18 months ago, have been negotiating a Canada plus type trade deal. Instead,
But you're telling us now you don't want it. You're telling us...
I've never wanted it. I've never wanted it. I've never wanted a new EU treaty. And if the choice before me is a new EU treaty or WTO, I'll go WTO. And I believe with WTO, we've got a great platform to negotiate not just with Brussels, but many other parts of the world. That's my view, and I can't see what's wrong with that position.
What factual evidence have you got to support that view? There is none.
Well, I've got factual evidence that there are countries out there, like tiny, tiddly countries like Singapore, etc., who are able on their own.
You're going to insult the Singaporeans now.
No, many people. Look.
Could you just say small country rather
small?
than big?
Okay, but we're told
that would be much better.
We're told by Lord Heseltine that we're a tiny little country. We couldn't possibly survive on our own. Eric, I'm going to have to end it there. Do call again. It's 6:30. It's time for the news with Lisa Riis.
Downing Street says Boris Johnson won't resign if MPs hand him another defeat by voting down his legislative agenda set out in today's Queen's speech. The Prime Minister's insisted leaving the EU will make the UK the best place to invest, start a business or start a family. But Labour and other opposition parties have dismissed it as farcical and a cynical political stunt ahead of a likely general election. A 32-year-old British man has died in Bulgaria, where England have a Euro qualifier tonight. Police in the city of Sofia are investigating. There have been reports of violence ahead of tonight's game. Extinction Rebellion activists have brought disruption to London's financial district in the city today as the number of arrests reaches more than 1,400 over the last week. Hundreds of protesters have been blocking the junction outside the Bank of England. LBC weather, rain clearing most areas overnight, but some showers still likely for Northern Ireland and southwest England, a low of 4 degrees.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast, LBC.
Reports that the EU officials now are demanding more and talking about another delay. David Linden is the SNP MP for Glasgow East.
Scotland, we voted by 62% to remain in the European Union, so I think that just hammers home more than ever the need for Scotland to choose its own future by way of independence.
What would the cost of a Scottish Air Force be?
So the costs for that have been outlined in the white paper.
What are the costs?
Well, I don't have them to my fingertips.
I'm not a member of Parliament. If I were, I would have those figures to hand.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast, weekday mornings from 7, LBC.
Keep your business moving with less to worry about. Buy a new Fiat Professional van from the Tecnico or Sportivo ranges and benefit from 5 years servicing, roadside assistance and warranty. That's 5 years peace of mind, the best foundation for any job. Find details on your local retailer at fiatprofessional.com. Terms, conditions and mileage limits apply.
Teaching shapes lives. Becoming a teacher means a career of opportunities. You could head a subject department or work towards school leadership. And with a minimum starting salary of £24,000 to £30,000, teaching has never been so rewarding. Teaching. Every lesson shapes a life. Search Get Into Teaching. Starting salary dependent on location.
Fly with Cathay Pacific and arrive ready to make the most of the endless white beaches of Bali. Book now at cathaypacific.com. Cathay Pacific. Move beyond.
In cinemas November 15.
So you're going to build a car to beat Ferrari? With a Ford. Correct.
Get ready for Le Mans 66.
They hate guys like us because we're different.
Starring Matt Damon and Christian Bale.
What are they doing? Making your car go faster. That's more like it!
Based on the incredible true story.
You got a plan? It's high risk.
Of Ford versus Ferrari.
No, I thought the whole point was to win the damned race.
Le Mans 66. In cinemas and IMAX November 15.
Hi, I'm back. I just set a personal best on my park run. Feels great.
That's lovely, Mike. I think you've earned the right to put all the bins out.
Hey?
With Vitality Life Insurance, you get properly rewarded when you're active. In fact, you could save over £730 every year in discounts and rewards from our partners. Join over 1 million customers. Just search Vitality Life. Vitality. Positively different. Annual savings available with certain plans and are dependent on members' usage of rewards available. Terms and conditions apply.
Play along with our 10-second teaser. Ready? Who is the patron saint of accountancy? The answer is St. Matthew the Evangelist. If you got that right, you must be pretty smart. So you'll know who to choose for your business accounting, audit and tax affairs.
In Catalonia, the one that had not been sanctioned by Madrid, and I did cover that at the time, and the fact that many of the leading participants had been arrested. Well, today, Spain's Supreme Court has sentenced 9 Catalan separatist leaders to between 9 and 13 years in prison for sedition over their role in that independence referendum in October 2017. 3 other defendants were found guilty of disobedience and fined, but imagine that, some of them up to 13 years in prison for organising a referendum, and a new arrest warrant's been issued for the former Catalan president, Carlos Puigdemont. So, a little bit of advice to Extinction Rebellion: don't go and protest in Spain, because goodness knows what might happen to you. I have to say, it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, can you imagine if the Scottish held their own, referendum? I mean, we might disapprove strongly of them doing it if they hadn't got permission of the law, but we wouldn't put them in prison. And I have to say, this to me says quite a lot about Spain. It really, really does. Any thoughts on that? Anyone think I've got that wrong? Then please tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. Back to compromise. Now, I'm asked here, and it's a perfectly reasonable question. There's no doubt about it. Dan says to me, is there any feasible Brexit deal that you would support, or do you think there is nothing short of no deal you would see as a proper Brexit? Dan, I'm going to repeat the point. I've always thought that a sensible, tariff-free, quota-free deal with our European neighbours just makes doing business a little bit easier. You don't need a trade deal to do business, but it does make it a little bit easier. I've always supported that. What I don't support is what Mrs May did, and we saw it there from the Florence speech onwards, which was to keep a close and special partnership with the institutions of the European Union, to the point where what she presented wasn't Brexit. It was awful. Boris said it was dreadful. Jacob Rees-Mogg said it was dreadful. They're trying to get little bits of it improved. They're trying to put lipstick on the pig, but it appears they're desperate to get this through the House of Commons. Whether they can or not remains to be seen. I think a lot will depend on the attitude the EU show over the course of the next few days. But there is the other factor here, that there's a growing campaign in Westminster amongst the Remainers to try and force a referendum. To force a referendum between this treaty or the existing EU treaty. I hope to goodness we don't come to that, because that would mean our democracy would have been completely and utterly trashed, because there would not be a proper leave option to vote for. I hope and pray, for everybody's sake, including our standing in the world, that does not come to pass. But there are many in Parliament who would like it to. Ben is a new caller from Claygate in Surrey. Good evening, Ben.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I am. Well, I'm okay, but I wouldn't be if we finished up with this treaty being passed and I mean, Ben, what would I do if there was a referendum between existing membership of the European Union or this new EU treaty? I mean, what would I do, Ben?
Well, I think you should plumb for this treaty. I mean, I'm phoning as a Remainer, a passionate Remainer.
Okay.
When we got the result through, I felt like someone had died. And, of course, my immediate response for sort of months, if not years after, was let's have another referendum. But as you say, as many say, if we were to have that referendum, if it were to go the other way, it doesn't feel like the end of the matter. How much of the population will feel cheated by that result? But what I will say as a Remainer is that I'm still frightened to death of a no deal. What it would mean for small businesses and the labyrinth of contracts that would have to be sort of cracked open and that sort of state of uncertainty. So for me, I've, like I said, a passionate Remainer, but I see this deal, a deal is the only way for us to separate. And this deal has sort of a backstop flavour to it that would be the sort of status quo, but it does provide a platform, an aspiration for a more sort of ambitious deal that, could be something remarkable. But at the same time, it may not be. The backstop arrangement we're pretty comfortable with. But what I would say is that sort of compromise from Jacob Rees-Mogg is really heartening for me as a Remainer compromising. If an ultra-Brexiteer can compromise, then this really could be something that we could all move forward with.
OK, well, Ben, 2 quick points. Firstly, 95% of small businesses do not trade with the European Union at all. At all. Millions of small businesses, and indeed many medium-sized businesses, don't deal with the EU at all. And that's really important because sometimes
their supply chains will be involved with, that trade. You just have to look at the current account deficit. We know how much we import.
Yeah.
We know how much we import. Small businesses' supply chains will be disrupted by no deal, and they don't have the time or the finances to prepare for no deal.
Ben, our shops are full of products from countries with whom we trade on WTO terms. There's so much in our shops that comes from China.
There's plenty of them, but they're not full of them. The dominant supplier is of course the EU. It's just in the economic.
And why wouldn't that continue, Ben? Why wouldn't that continue?
Well, they would have to pay the associated tariff and the additional inflated cost of sterling weakness means that those goods will become prohibitive for small businesses. That's why it's crucial that we get a deal. I'm not advocating a second referendum or remaining. I just think we need a deal. And from there we can. This arrangement gives us a platform for something more ambitious. But if we don't get that more ambitious final destination, we have this sort of insurance policy of avoiding no deal, and that's a compromise from a Remainer. And it's great that a Brexit is offering that compromise.
I understand what you're saying. And by the way, don't try and predict what sterling's going to do. That's a mug's game, all right? It could go up as well.
Well, I think we all know. We can see it from the day-to-day headlines. When no deal is threatened, sterling weakens. And when we have more security of a deal, sterling strengthens. We saw that on Friday. Sterling went up 4% on this improved prospect of a deal. So I think we can feel pretty confident that sterling will move firm on a deal arrangement and weaker on a no-deal arrangement.
I think the market speculated already very heavily for a no deal. But hey, Ben, here's my worry, all right? We enter into this never land where we're not in and we're not out and we go through years of agony. And we may find ourselves
years of political agony for people like you.
Economic agony. No, economic agony.
Because businesses will be comforted.
There'll be
by the fact that we're not going to be
Ben,
without a deal.
Ben, we'll be exactly as we've been for the last 3 years, and for the last year,
we'd have the long-term confidence that we're not going to be crashing out without a deal. Now, that sort of insurance would be comforting for boardrooms all around the world.
But Ben, we would not know what our final destination is, and for investment, that still is not good.
We know that it wouldn't be.
And when you say no deal, Ben, why is Chancellor Merkel so scared of us leaving with a clean break?
Well, because it would be economically damaging for her. There's no winners out of no deal. I'm not saying it's good news for Germany.
Well, and Mr. Verhofstadt says we will not allow the United Kingdom to become an offshore Hong Kong or Singapore. They're terrified of us leaving single market rules and being more competitive, Ben.
Well, there are certainly some deep Europhiles that are more that are more nervous of a sort of some offshore tax haven, but that's not what we're going to become. Our country would not allow us to become something like that.
But
so the idea that we could become something like that is just for the birds. You know, we don't have that level of free market desire. We have much more ingrained sort of socialist cultures here.
Well, Ben, we would have. I guess the answer to that is we would at least have the choice. And I fear for the next few years. Where Ben, look, you've made the point for compromise and made it very, very well indeed. Thank you. And there's somebody who voted Remain who thinks this is perhaps the best way forward. And I guess actually, if I was a Remainer, I might think that this was the best way forward. Equally, if I was a Remainer, I'd be very, very scared of a second referendum with a genuine leave option. But I wouldn't be at all scared of a referendum between one treaty and another, because there the status quo could well win, it seems to me. Nigel, you've been correct about Boris. Look, I repeat the point. I'm not trying to be negative about Boris Johnson. I wish him well. He's been tied in knots by Parliament, but think about this point. The calling of the Queen's speech, what's the upside been today? Just about zero. What did it provoke? It provoked the Supreme Court, it provoked the Benn Act, and actually all the way through that, he had a 30-day get-out-of-jail-free card from the Germans to put up new proposals. And I do think the one massive mistake Boris made was calling this Queen's speech, and it really has gone off like a damp squib today. It really, really has. You are listening to The Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 6:45 and time for the news headlines with Lisa Riis.
Downing Street says Boris Johnson won't resign if MPs hand him another defeat by voting down his legislative agenda set out in today's Queen's speech. A British man has died in Bulgaria ahead of England's Euro 2020 qualifier.
Well, it was the Queen's speech today, and Joan says to me, Boris says he won't resign if the Queen's speech is defeated, but I don't think the Queen will be best pleased, as she's been used as a Conservative advertisement for their election campaign. Well, this is exactly, Joan, what Jeremy Corbyn was saying today. So if the Queen's speech is voted down, can she just sack him? Well, Joan, I think the Fixed Term Parliament Act confuses all of this, and no, there'll be, in theory, there'll be 14, if a government loses a motion of confidence, then there's 14 days for a new group of people to come together to try to form a majority, and if nobody can convince the Queen they've got a majority, there would be a general election. So that's how it should work. But do you know something, Joan? In these unprecedented times, it's very difficult to predict. On YouTube, Nigel, no compromise. This deal will not get through Parliament, says John. Well, John, I hope you are right, because this is not a compromise, it's a sellout. It kicks the can down the road. There's no guarantee of anything positive coming at the end of this, and we will be at the mercy of EU lawmakers for the next few years with no voice, no vote and no veto. I would much rather, if necessary, wait for a general election and give the people a chance to say what they really think. Sarah is a new caller from Coventry. Good evening, Sarah.
Hello, Nigel. Thanks for having me on. Oh, gosh, I have to say, I'm absolutely furious about this whole mess.
Well, do you know what, Sarah? You're not alone. You're not alone on that.
I just don't know how they keep going on and on and on about the same old things. Oh, all right. So we've compromised. We keep on compromising. Where does it stop? They just don't want us to have a say. They don't want us to be able to vote on this at all. I'd be more interested to find out what we're actually still going to be tied to. You know, what closer unions are we going to be locked into that we're not going to be able to ever get out of in this deal?
Well,
I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Well, Sarah, what will happen is, Mrs May said, well, with this, we will be free. We will leave the customs union single market, take back control of our borders. But all of that was dependent on them agreeing to those things in return for a trade deal. And that's my worry, is I think that if this was...
They're never going to give us a trade deal, ever.
Do you know what?
Do you
know what? Barnier, I know Barnier. I tell you what, he's very good at what he does, whether you like him or not.
Oh, he's a right glagger, isn't he?
Well, he's certainly a better negotiator than our mob have been, that is for certain. But his intention from day one was to keep us trapped inside the customs union, to stop us becoming competitive. That's what they're scared of, Sarah.
I absolutely agree with that.
Tell me, what would you like to see?
I just want us out now. I've had enough. You know, you can't even comment on a YouTube video now without even being called a racist or a bigot or a xenophobe anymore. And that's from people from my own country. it's just ridiculous. It's beyond the point where people are not even discussing the actual merits of leaving anymore. You can't even have a proper conversation with people because they just resort to the same old, easy dig at people. We've compromised every step of this way. We should never have been put in this situation by Theresa May, where we're negotiating the elbow about bum. Do you know what I mean? We shouldn't be even discussing this.
It's shocking, but I tell you what would be even more shocking, Sarah. Jason in Epsom says to me confidently that this treaty will be amended and subject to a confirmatory referendum. So
how are we going to amend it when we can't even have a veto on anything that we're going to be signed up to at the Never?
So what would happen?
We're not even going to have any representative in the European Union after that.
So what Jason is referring to is Parliament this Saturday. What he's saying is the treaty will be passed subject to us having a referendum. So this is what some people want to do.
On this deal or remaining?
Yes.
So what sort of choice is that?
Sarah?
What sort of choice is that for someone that wants to leave?
I think if this, yeah.
I wanted to leave by the time of my 40th birthday in April. So that was my birthday present to me. And it's just not going to happen. You can smell the change, on the news at the moment as well. The narrative is starting to change, even with, but it's a compromise, it's this, that and the other. No, it's not. It is a compromise, a massive compromise on our part. I haven't seen one thing where the European Union has said, we'll go with that because that's in the interest of the British people. Not one thing. Angela Merkel,
I agree with
she's
you.
Already said.
And
she's
Sarah,
already said what she thinks, and that's all come out of the bag now. She was never going to let Northern Ireland make their own decision on this.
No, of course not. Of course not. Sarah, I have to say this to you. I do understand the upset, the despondency. I have to say, if we were given a referendum with no proper leave choice, that would be an absolute travesty for our country. But you know what, Sarah? In the end, the Brexiteers are going to win because the polls show actually now support for leaving as you want to with a clean break is now way above those who want us to have second referendums. And I think in the end we're going to get there. Sarah, keep the faith. I'm going to go to Don, who's a new caller from Redcar. Don, good evening to you.
Hello, Nigel. Thank you for taking the call.
Not one little bit. So, compromise. That's what they say, Don. Do you think that makes sense?
No, it's a stitch-up.
Is it?
Yes. The way they've got it, this bill will be... sorry, I'm a little bit tongue-tied. This bill will be announced on Saturday, and both sides will seem to compromise and vote it through. They will not give us a second vote on it because we voted the wrong way the last time when we voted to leave. And then after they've done that, both ladies in Parliament today were calling for more or less electioneering speeches.
Don,
after that, they will call a general election, and us genuine Brexiteers will be considered extremists, even though we had the majority in the democratic vote.
Don, I get the feeling that you think that our political class are just going to stop Brexit completely.
Yes, the same way as they have always done.
Don't you think, Don, that in the end, there's one very powerful thing that people have, and that's their vote. And that in the end, if they enrage enough people like you, and you decide to do different, in the end, public opinion must win, surely.
Nigel, in my lifetime, I have seen the decimation of the mining industry. I lived through the miners' strike. I've seen the steel industry, the shipbuilding, the whole of the North East be laid waste. And even with Mr. Riis, who I've got a lot of respect for, the way he is saying compromise now, it seems to be all about the Conservative Party and unifying their vote than actually delivering on what is best for the country.
I think there's a lot of truth in what you say, Don. A lot of this is about the Conservative Party and keeping them together. I agree with you. Don, thank you for calling, despite your... real anger in Don's voice about what is going on here. So, this is a rehashed Theresa May deal described by Mogg at the time as completely cretinous and a betrayal of common sense. But now he is urging his hardline Brexiteers to vote for it. Surely, if politicians can change their minds, then we can too. Well, do you know what? I don't think Jacob Rees-Mogg has changed his mind. I think he's just been forced into this position because he's there. He is a member of the cabinet. I don't think he's enjoying this one little bit. We're in for a very, very dramatic week. We may not know until Thursday exactly what the amendments to the original Mrs May treaty are going to be. We may not know. But hold on tight for the end of this week. It is going to be a very, very dramatic week in politics. I'll be back with you tomorrow at 6 o'clock. Don't miss Jacob Rees-Mogg, 8:30 tomorrow morning, on with Nick Ferrari. At 10 tonight, it's Tom Swarbrick. Up now, it's Ian Dale.
And I'm holding on tight, Nigel. Thank you very much indeed. Now,